The Transgration Academy for the Magical Arts. Main Garden. Local time, 1700. Emma. The gardens were peaceful, tranquil, almost enough to lull you into a sense of unearned calm if you fell for its carefully manicured ambience. However, just like everything else in the academy, there was a rhyme and a reason for this. A carefully seated intent meant to instill meaning into what would otherwise be an arbitrary setting for discourse. In other words, the gardens were a trap for the foolish and less than wary. Though, there was also the option that the gardens were just that, a garden. And maybe, just maybe, I was just projecting my second most negative experience here at the academy with a locale that didn't deserve it. Whatever the case was, it was clear the man chose this location for a reason, and the closer I got to where we needed to be, so too did I realize the real intent behind this strange venue for an unprompted meeting. He was standing, or rather sitting, atop of the exact same spot Apprentice Lartia was just a week ago, on that fateful encounter, on an exact replica of that outdoor chair and table set. This couldn't have been a coincidence. Nothing could be a coincidence here at the academy. At least, until it did, at which point...
"Ah, Cadet Emma Booker,"
the white-robed dean announced with a polite, cordial, almost fatherly tone of voice.
"Always a pleasure, and most certainly a departure from routine, to be host to these engagements."
He slowly but surely began shifting his gaze from whatever it was he was preoccupied with on the table towards me, something that was generating way more than its fair share of mana radiation warnings than should have been reasonable.
"Please, have a seat."
He gestured towards the empty seat across from him. It was only after I'd walked past him that I finally saw what he was preoccupied with, and the source of all of those mana radiation pings. On top of the ornate wrought iron table was a circular wooden tray 2 feet or so diameter, atop of which were about 20 or so different cups, pots, saucers, and containers, surrounding one of those dual flask siphons containing a clear amber liquid. An accompanying ensemble of floating utensils made their way from one container to another, each of them seemingly involved in some niche, single-purpose use. There were specific tools for stirring, for straining, for mixing dry ingredients, and even to pick apart different dry ingredients in order to layer them meticulously, one atop of the other. All of these enigmatic, or frankly, unnecessarily complicated processes were dedicated towards one aim, however. An aim that I anticipated almost immediately as soon as a cup and saucer began magically levitating my way, landing in front of me as I took my seat. The whole setup, all of this effort, was an overcomplicated means of brewing...
"Tea?"
the dean inquired warmly, levitating a smaller pot of swirling liquid that continued to slosh and whirl even in spite of there being nothing to keep the whirlpool going. "I'm quite all right, Professor, but thank you for the offer," I responded politely, cordially, but without any of the familiarity that I'd otherwise reserved for the gang or potential allies. This was a purely professional affair, and despite what this whole whimsy setup and the warmth of the backdrop might otherwise indicate, all of this was just set dressing for a meeting that was bound to be heavy.
"Ah, not one for specialty brews, I imagine,"
the dean replied with a quirk of his brow. "I would if I could, Professor, and as much as this might break cultural norms or social protocols, I'm afraid I am physically incapable of accepting this offer," I retorted frankly, and despite not displaying any outright malice or annoyance, the statement managed to carry those undertones all the same. I believe we both understand why this is the case.
"Indeed we do,"
the man responded curtly, his eyes sharpening, if only just for a moment, before retracting the saucer and cup.
"But it's the gesture that counts, no? There are traditions and courtesies that must be upheld and expectant rules that must be enforced. I do not mind if my efforts go to waste in this case, though what I will mind is if my efforts following this will bear the same fate."
The mood and tone of the whole scene shifted drastically at this, as several mana radiation signatures beeped, signaling the departure of the shadowy apprentice, and the erection of a cone of silence, no doubt.
Do you know why I have summoned you here today, Cadet Imabuka?
I haven't the slightest clue, Professor, I responded, with barely any emotive resonance, only a neutrality that countered the Professor's more accusatory demeanor.
You have been informed by Apprentice Arlan Ostoy as to your transgressions, have you not? He countered.
I have been informed by Apprentice Arlan Ostoy that I am to censor myself, yes, though I cannot for the life of me imagine what transgression he or you are currently referring to. The Dean narrowed his eyes at this, at my attempt to lawyer my way out of this whole situation. Alert! Localized surge of mana radiation detected. 250% above background radiation levels. What appeared to be a hologram hovered between us now, set atop of the T-siphon, displaying a scene seemingly recorded from the POV of the apprentice himself.
I apologize for breaching expectant decorum by disrupting your points of personal privilege. However, your current aim to disrupt has triggered this outcome. I suggest you avoid broaching this particular talking point, Cadet Imabuka. If it needs to be said, Cadet Imabuka, we are here to discuss your aim to disrupt and the bad faith statements made in order to incite social confusion, discohesion, and ultimately disorderly unrest amongst your peers.
I took a moment to regard that statement, and like before, a part of me wanted desperately to match the man tit for tat. I reached for my tablet, aiming to play out the recordings of that day as a part of my counter-argument, but more so, simply to flex the capabilities of technology on the stubborn old man. But I didn't. There was a chance he was still in the dark about that particular capability. And with the drone still in his office, it'd be best to keep that particular flex hidden for now. I understand that is what was, and clearly still is, being alleged, Professor. However, I still stand by my statements. I cannot for the life of me understand nor interpret how or why my words during the course of that mixer were considered to be an aim to disrupt. I have made my purpose here at the Academy clear from day one, and expanded on my intentions on the day of that emergency assembly. I am here in order to facilitate diplomatic dialogue, to learn and to participate in benign and mutually constructive acts of cultural exchange. If the consequences of my actions and statements were in fact disruptive, then perhaps it is merely due to the inherently disruptive nature of my existence, which I cannot mitigate. To ask that I stop would be akin to asking that I drink that cup of tea that was offered. It is a physical impossibility, or at worst, a disingenuous act with an intent to subvert the truth. The Professor regarded my retort with a calm and expressionless stare, though behind those peaceful eyes was a growing frustration, which made itself clear in the stubbornness of his response. The subversion of the truth can be defined as an intent to misinform, a very act that was observed for your public discourse, a privilege granted by the Nexus in recognition of your rights as a candidate and a student. You are currently testing those privileges by the very nature of the subjects you chose to consistently fixate and broach. And what exactly do you classify as a subversion of the truth, Professor? At what specific point did I cross the threshold of benign dialogue to outright disruption? I shot back, cutting right through the fat. By your very admission, Cadet Imabuka, the point in which you started discussing your supposed nature and the implications stemming from your supposed mannerless disposition. I paused at that acknowledgement, at just how utterly ridiculous it was, given everything he knew. You do understand, Professor, that my mannerless disposition is something that isn't a lie. Let me cut right to the chase. Nothing I've been discussing thus far, or in the mixer for that matter, was in any way a lie. I've been attempting to address this politely, but I believe it needs to be said outright. I don't acknowledge Apprentice Arlan Ostoy, and by extension, your claims of my supposed transgressions, simply because these so-called transgressions were the truth. I paused, making a point to lean in closer, if only by a single inch. And I know for a fact that you know this to be the case. The Professor matched my movements as he leaned forward, pushing aside his alchemy tea set to meet my gaze. Behind those eyes was a knowing look, one that hinted at a mind that knew better. Yet the words that emerged refused to betray even a hint of it.
It is your truth, Cadet Amabuka. The truth that you purport to believe. A truth that stands against the truth of this great alliance of realms, and the greatest realm of all, the Nexus itself.
So you're saying that the truth from a singular new realm is enough to threaten the social cohesion and benefit of all these other realms?
You delude yourself in your visions of grandeur, Cadet Amabuka, which comes to prove my point of your lack of self-control. No, the point isn't that you, nor your ramblings, have the capacity to threaten, let alone topple the cohesion of our great confluence of realms. The point is that the threat of it, as minute as it may be, is what needs to be taken seriously. Status Eternia was, and still is maintained, not just by addressing only the largest of cracks, or the grandest of threats, but by focusing on even the most minor of inconveniences, thereby ensuring stability for the wisdom of foresight and the act of prevention.
The man took a moment to pause, leaning in even closer, as he made it clear what was coming next was no longer up for discussion.
But enough of these arguments, Cadet Amabuka. Regardless of whether or not you may wish to admit your transgressions, my decision on your behavior henceforth is final. I will not take any formal actions against these transgressions, but I expect that no further transgressions will take place following this discussion. You are to cease all public discourse on all matters pertaining to your supposed mannerless status, and you are to cease public displays that are aimed at subverting the truth for your own aims.
There we go. The gag order. And what if I refuse? I shot back diplomatically, testing the waters before laying down my own boundaries. Because by committing to your expectations, we are leaving an existential elephant in the room to roam freely without being addressed. This leaves a massive walking contradiction to your narrative to roam the halls, making things as much of a headache for you as it is for me. Moreover, any further discourse, and any hope at diplomatic dialogue, will be utterly compromised by the lack of foundational trust that must be garnered by addressing the blatant discrepancy that is my very existence.
I believe the general pervasive theory is that in lieu of your mannerless claims, you merely are manner deficient. Or at least, that is what seems to be the word amongst the student body at present.
The professor replied promptly, almost as if that answer was supposed to help. Which it did. But it more so helped further his aims than my own.
Moreover, I believe you will find much greater obstacles ahead for your diplomatic endeavors than the issue of your supposed mannerless status, Cadet Amabuka.
The elf's tone darkened, and so too did the general mood and ambience around us.
That is, of course, if you do not comply.
Blunt threats are unbecoming of you, Professor, I shot back, with an Eleanor Grey sneer.
Oh, I am afraid you are misinterpreting my intent, Cadet Amabuka. Indeed, you will find that I am the last person here who wishes to threaten you of all people. You are my student, after all, a pupil of the Academy. I am, in fact, protecting you against a threat you very well should be aware of.
He spoke cryptically, maintaining both the warm persona and the more severe aura of authority. Is he talking about Maltori, the Null, the Inquisition, or whatever investigation is going on right now? I didn't reply, refusing to acknowledge it either way.
I am, of course, referring to an event which would have otherwise spelled the end of your diplomatic endeavors here at the Academy. The death of Lord Lartia.
It was at that point that my heart practically sank, as the ramifications of that night started to really hit hard. Practically, I knew that Lartia had died. That fact was more or less certain, but it hadn't truly sunk in yet what that meant. His death was so removed from everything going on, and so sudden, that it just never clicked with me the way it was right now.
An investigation is naturally underway from the powers that be, with the intent of ascertaining the sequence of events on that tragic night. As it currently stands, the investigation is progressing smoothly, with nothing truly out of the ordinary. However...
The man paused for dramatic effect.
There are, of course, unverified and unsubstantiated accounts of an anomalous interloper present within the warehouse's vicinity prior to the explosion.
The Dean swooshed his hand, taking a moment to gesture towards the magical hologram in front of us, as I was treated to a slideshow of faces that I didn't recognize at first. It took me a few moments until it was clear why the Dean brought them up. These were townsfolk, all being recorded and interviewed, with each of them giving their account of the strange armored golem they saw dashing through town that night.
It was bizarre. It ran like it was out to get someone.
It was a monster! A monster, I tell you!
I wish there were more people to see it. I swore I saw it. I swear it on my life.
You get used to these things. Living next to a magic academy? You see sights like these as often as you see miracles in the Crownlands. On my honor, I saw it blitzing as fast as a wild Pegasus. I'm just a simple guardsman. I couldn't have stopped it if I wanted to. We'd have had countermeasures for such wanton species and such, if not for the local council.
I'd rather refrain from commenting, thank you.
We toppled my cabbage cart. I demand reparations.
The Dean paused it there, making sure to maintain eye contact as he continued.
I have personally dismissed such tall tales, however, especially given that these claims occurred concurrently to reports of a werebeast cries being heard in the immediate area prior to the explosion.
The Dean once again gestured to the change in the hologram's roster of interviewees. This time the faces were much more recognizable. This set of faces belonged to the warehouse workers I managed to save by spooking them off using audio clips of the werebeast's menacing growls.
Aye, this warehouse business. It was most definitely, assuredly, and positively the act of the werebeast. Exactly. All of us heard it. Even a laugh here took the risk of diving head first into the canal to avoid its wrath.
And everyone knows Alaf the level-headed is not one to overreact, save for times when it's life or death. The Dean paused the footage there before cleaning up the hologram altogether.
It must be noted, however, that the investigation is still currently ongoing and nothing is truly set in stone. New evidence could very well easily confirm or deny these aforementioned allegations, at which point...
The man paused, making it clear what his intentions were.
I believe diplomacy will become the least of your concerns, Cadet Amabuka.
A moment of silence descended on the conversation following that, as the man made a point to leave that thread hanging, refusing to even punctuate the scene with a sip of his tea. Yet in spite of the obvious blackmail, and the clear power play and threats at play here, there was one question that came to mind above all else. A question that tied back to the veracity of his dubious claims of protection, and the lip service he paid to the whole respect he had for his pupils. So why haven't you yet? I snapped back bluntly. Why refrain from simply outing me outright to the investigation? I doubt it's simply due to the kindness of your heart. So were you just holding on to this as ammunition, just in case?
This has all been a matter of reciprocity, Cadet Amabuka,
the man announced firmly.
I had hesitated to commit your name and your involvement out of respect for your actions in resolving our brief dispute with the library.
I took a moment to regard the man's features as he spoke. His body language, indeed, everything about him at that point, felt honest, and not in the usual half-baked honesty he usually fronted.
However, I cannot guarantee that hesitancy and a refusal to divulge information alone will be enough to ensure a lack of any further testimonies on my part, he quickly added,
as despite the honesty presented, that authoritative overture once more returned.
The investigation is still ongoing, after all, and I cannot judge just how far my reports of omission will continue to hold their weight without more active involvement.
Are you saying you would willingly commit to testifying on my behalf if it came to it? I blurted out bluntly, prompting the man's features to curmudgeon, as if he wasn't expecting something that blunt in response.
In a manner of speaking, in your words and not my own, yes.
And do you expect me to believe that when presented with the choice of acquiescing to the pressures of an investigation and defending a new realmer, that you would choose the latter rather than the former, just to maintain a gag order of all things? The man actually sighed this time around, finally coming around to taking a sip of his still piping hot tea.
I do believe I have alluded to this point already, Cadet Booker. Just the week prior in my office, in fact. But if it needs to be said, then so it shall be done.
He shifted his seat forwards, placing both of his hands in front of him.
My aims as the Dean of this Academy have always been the same as any other. I wish to accomplish the goal set forth by our founder, to bring about enlightenment and brotherhood to all that enter for our doors. It may not seem like it to you now, New Realmer, but I hope to one day see your realm joining the ranks of all others that came before it. Just as I one day hope to see you becoming a productive member of the student body. I wish to see all of this done under the successful completion of your candidacy, under my tenure and reign.
And there it was. The difference between the Dean and Maltori. The fundamental difference in their underlying interests. The one difference that made the Dean tolerable and Maltori impossible to reason with. Their endgame. PSYOP Lesson 27. Once the chance for dialogue opens, then anything is possible. The difference between a party open to at least the smallest of dialogues and a party that refuses any discourse is not just significant, it's astronomical. This wasn't to say that the Dean had suddenly become a saint or an ally with that revelation, but it did mean that there was at least a dialogue that could be had, and an angle through which I could approach him. Moreover, it meant that I could play ball and push the limits of his agreements with enough wiggle room to work with. This meant that despite the draconian gag order, that the consequences of defiance would be less catastrophic than what it would have otherwise been with someone like Maltori. Beyond that, though, the fact that he'd adhered to the whole favour and saving face system Thacia had mentioned before proved that the man at least followed some sort of social framework. Though once again, the mileage of how far that could go remained to be seen. So, to clarify your terms, what you're asking from me is to, quote, cease all public discourse on matters pertaining to my mannerless status, and public displays aimed at subverting the truth for my own aims.
Correct, Cadet Booker. That should be simple enough to follow through with, no?
Oh yes, I nodded. Doesn't look like I have too much of a choice, after all. The Transgration Academy for the Magical Arts. En route to the Armorer's Workshop. Local time, 2000. Emma.
It would indeed appear as if you lack any choice in the matter, Emma,
Thacia remarked darkly, as we just about wrapped up dinner and a complete review of the events at the garden.
Compliance is something the Academy, and by extension the Nexus, is an expert at securing,
Thalmin added darkly, just to round out the dour mood from the group. It was, however, Eleanor that remained surprisingly quiet, as if he knew what I was about to propose next. Yeah, compliance really is my only move here, isn't it? I replied, my tone slipping into the facetious with each passing syllable. But unfortunately for the Dean, he didn't really specify what he meant by my own aims now, did he? I began grinning, as each step we took was punctuated by a small, unnoticeable skip of underhanded joy. We're still ultimately students at the Academy, are we not? And as a result, we're expected to try our best in class. So when factoring in the fact that I lack the fancy smanchy magical abilities everyone else has to fast-track their way through lessons, what's stopping me from showing off a bit of tech-based shenanigans here and there? I announced, with a mischievous self-satisfied cackle. After all, it's not explicitly for my own aims, if it's instead for the purpose of class and academic performance now, is it?
Malicious compliance.
Both Eleanor and Thalmin, for that matter, replied at about the same time, surprising me with how they seemed to be on point in this one particular subject matter. Yes, sirree, I acknowledged, barely holding down my signature fangy grin. And I didn't even need PSYOP training for this one. It's just something hardwired, hard-coded, and seemingly ingrained in every human being out of principle. Second nature, you could say.
That sounds less like a race of noble-minded thinkers and more a race of spiteful gremlins, Eleanor chastised.
We can be both, I offered half-jokingly. Still, I know you were thinking the same thing here, Eleanor. You're one for the theatrical, correct? Well, this is the ultimate theatre, is it not? To act without saying, and to perform without outright spoiling the plot with exposition. Leave the audience hungry for more, and to entice them to return for the next act. The Venerian paused, as if actually pondering those words, before returning to his half-aggravated persona without acknowledging my question. The silence was enough of an answer for me, though. Thacia, having pondered my words up to this point, filled in the void of conversation Eleanor had left behind. Moreover, since public discourse will be completely removed from your purview, these unexplained, inexplicable, and unexpected acts of mannerless miracles would inevitably lead to the natural proliferation of intrigue, which would allow us to be able to pinpoint the sorts of people who are naturally more inclined towards investigating the unexplainable, the sorts of people that actually have an inclination towards curiosity and who would actively seek out answers, the sort of people that would be most receptive towards more unconventional talking points. I completed Thacia's thoughts for her, as we both nodded at that point. Addressing a crowd is a whole other ballgame than dealing with an individual who is actively seeking answers. This whole arrangement might just be to our benefit then. We just about finished crossing that long walkway connecting the armory to the academy at the end of that whole conversation. However, upon arrival, we were met not with Sorosar's golems, but a set of gargoyles blocking the way to his door. Moreover, a massive sign that read, "Temporarily inaccessible," was carefully placed upon the ornate double doors, prompting us to stop in our tracks.
"Students."
One of the gargoyles came forward. His voice was coarse and quite literally gravelly.
"The armorer is currently indisposed as a result of Academy affairs. Please return from whence you came."
May I ask for how long, or what exactly is going on in there? I shot back.
"The armory is expected to return to standard operating hours beginning tomorrow. Now please, return from whence you came."
The responses felt canned and rehearsed, almost like I was talking to one of those ancient automated response messaging systems, which didn't bode well for us and today's side quest. I would have said a stare down soon ensued, but it was more like I was too deep in thought to really come up with a reply, the result being a tense standoff, apparently manifesting between the motionless gargoyle and the motionless suit of power armor. Emma, I suggest that we simply return tomorrow.
Kathunk!
The double doors suddenly opened. However, instead of the armourer or even the apprentice, what emerged was a long, elongated, unknown object, hidden underneath a massive tarp. Beneath that were several gargoyles holding this unknown thing aloft, as 10s more eventually came out, all holding the mysterious object above their heads, walking forward and out of the armory in perfect synchrony. But that wasn't all. Hey, easy on the artifices. I don't want to bother our dear armourer with another rush order if something breaks. A familiar voice caterwauled, just out of view from where we were standing. You! Don't move that around too fast. It'll mess up the calibration. You, pick up the slack. We need those weights on the floor before the mythic encabulator. You, hurry up with those path treads. We can come back for the flyers next time. Come on! You're not the ones on the starting lines tomorrow. A veritable stream of gargoyles soon began marching out, each hauling tarp-covered objects of varying sizes. It took about a good 5 minutes before they were done, and by the end of it, a familiar-looking professor emerged from within the armory. A professor that I had yet to have had the pleasure of studying with. A certain feline that stared back at our group with her signature fanged grin, and a posture that screamed PE teacher. Ah, why, hello. Come to take a peek at the goods we have? Well, colour me flattered, I haven't had students that interested in the deep lore of physical education in literal decades. Oh, I'm afraid we were here to meet Professor Pliska, ma'am, I replied frankly. Ah, well, still,
A girl can drink, can she not? She sighed. Anyways, I'm afraid the man's busy. Busy with prep work for the specialized artifices needed in the house-choosing ceremony, and for tomorrow's PE class. She managed out a grin as wide as a Cheshire cat, gesturing at the procession of gargoyles now heading off into the distance, and carrying off the artificers in question. I hope you're ready, students, because tomorrow we're going to be putting your skills to the test. Both wits and vigor.